Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, we're revisiting the interdisciplinary field of comic studies. Our guests are Candida and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They've authored the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. The title is part of the Crossing Lines series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. You may recall the interview we did in April 2024 with Dale Jacobs, who wrote on comics and grief, which is also part of the Crossing Lines series. Graphic Refuge examines how comics, through art and narrative, portray the refugee experience and seek to humanize the representations of the displaced in our current mass media ecosystem. Further, the title explores the dynamics of what it means to be a citizen and/or a refugee. But before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File podcast, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this first episode, we're introduced to the genre of refugee comics, examples of titles, the various mediums that they can appear in, and who these works are intended for. Okay, Candida and Dom, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Hi there. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. Maybe to start, if you could define refugee comics for us, and perhaps how you both defined, refugee for your book. And Candida, why don't we start with you on that?
Sure. One of the things that we were thinking about in this book is how narrow the legal definition of refugee is, because legally, a refugee is someone who's been granted asylum by a government in a court because they have proven their fear of persecution in a home country. But that is a very limited definition, and we didn't want to perpetuate that kind of governmental understanding of who is a refugee, because I think it's fairly common sense that there are people who are refugees and forcibly displaced people who might not meet those government or state criteria. So we were thinking about a whole spectrum of experiences, and it really comes down to people who have been forcibly displaced from home, usually due to conflict or war, but increasingly because of climate change as well. So one of our key influences in the book, and we were actually grateful that he wrote the foreword to the book, is Vinh Nguyen. And he has a great short definition of who is a refugee that goes beyond that legal one. He says refugees are those who have sought, are seeking, or will imminently seek refuge. So it's more what he calls the refugee subject than that legal definition.
Excellent, thank you. Perfect. So, coming back to the comic medium, I'm wondering if you could tell the story of how you see the history of refugee comics. Can you provide some examples of how they've been used, by refugees or governments, nonprofit organizations, and so on, to tell various stories? And Dom, why don't we start with you on that one?
So the refugee comics we're interested in the book, almost all, though not entirely, but mostly published after 2015, when the European refugee crisis, and I use that word crisis in inverted commas, kind of brought refugees and mass displacement around the world to the attention of particularly white European readers for not the first time, but in a sort of very prominent way, and a prominent feature in the media. And this led to a sudden boom, I think, in comics telling refugee stories, seeking to sort of feed into and combat the sort of negative media narratives that were dominating in Europe at the time. But there's a lot of very interesting different strands of history feeding into this particular genre, this very recent, very contemporary genre, drawing as a documentary practice runs back centuries. And there's always been this long connection. It's something Hilary Chute talks about in her book, Disaster Drawn. There's always been this long connection between drawing as a means of documenting war and violence, and also displacement is absolutely central to that. And that's partly to do with the fact that the people who are living through war, or people who are detained in camps, or who are making their way across oceans, don't have the means, other means of recording their stories with them, other means of visualizing their stories, which obviously is, in the sort of modern era, we would think of as photography.
Right.
And photography is often kind of, disallowed or forbidden in detention centers and camps. So there's this tradition of documentary practice, and that's a really key feature, one key strand that feeds into the contemporary refugee comic. Just another one I think to mention, there are more, but is a kind of long history of stories of outsiders using comics. Comics are a kind of subcultural medium. They're not recognized as a kind of high culture, to use that phrase again in inverted commas. They're seen as kind of an outsider status, and comics have always therefore been drawn to the story of the outsider, the story of the person, of the alien, of the person who arrives from somewhere else, the foreigner or whatever. And the kind of great example of this is Superman, right? Who is a refugee from Krypton who arrives on planet Earth. So there's, in the DNA of comics, there's a kind of affiliation, a kind of cultural affiliation with stories of the displaced, and stories of outsiders, and stories of refugees. So these kind of cultural tendencies and also quite sort of practical limitations both feed into what we might think of as the contemporary refugee comic.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then, Candida, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I recently gave my first talk based on this book, and an audience member pointed out to me that one of the early American examples is by Minnie Okubo, who was a Japanese American who was interned during the Second World War. And she was an artist. So she drew pictures and she wrote stories. She and her brother were interned in Utah. And that book is called Citizen 13660. We don't write about it in the book because that Japanese American and Japanese Canadian internment is kind of a different experience. But we have these earlier 20th century examples. Dom and I also have an Australian colleague, Aaron Humphrey, who's doing work on World War I prisoner of war internment camp comics. So these are examples of the kinds of thing Dom is talking about, that included among many people who have been interned or displaced are artists. And so if they can get paper and pens or pencils when they are in a camp or on the move, they will draw their experience. And some of them have been sort of put in archives and are now being recovered, and some are being published. I also want to add something we point out in the book, which is that the kind of landmark canonical alternative comics are Mouse by Art Spiegelman and Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. And those are actually both also about the kinds of experiences we're looking at more recently. Mouse is about Art Spiegelman's father in Auschwitz. So we get a lot of those central images of camps and guard towers and bunks in a row that we're seeing now in more recent comics. And Persepolis is about the Iranian Revolution and Marjane Satrapi's experience as a young woman during that. So again, an example of a city in siege and a family trying to survive, and war, oppression and authoritarianism. So even those really central books, and those must be the two most taught graphic narratives in academia, even those are really central to this history of outsiders, oppressed people, displaced people using comics to tell their story.
Mm-hmm. And then it's, can you talk a little bit about sort of the organizations, not just refugees themselves who are drawing and writing these, but other organizational institutions that are leveraging them as well.
And I'll ask Dom to talk about positive negatives, but certainly nonprofits and organizations like the UNHCR, the United Nations High Council for Refugees, and the Red Cross have sponsored comics. One of the comics I write about in the book is an extraordinary book by a German, London-based artist, Olivier Kugler, called Escaping Wars and Waves, Encounter with Syrian Refugees. It's extraordinary because it's a big book and he uses double pages, and it's not a typical comic. But his work visiting 5 camps in the Middle East and in Europe where displaced Syrians were being housed was sponsored by MSF or Doctors Without Borders. So these organizations sometimes sponsor artists and sometimes help co-produce the comics, or at other times they sponsor artists and then the artists do kind of self-published or other work. So I would say there are different kinds of ways organizations and NGOs are participating. Sometimes they will produce short comics that are very activist driven. They might be for specific fundraising campaigns, or they might be for specific, situations like Darfur or Sudan or Syria. But they are often used as kind of activist tools, whereas they can also sponsor people to come in. And they also sponsor things like art therapy tents in refugee camps or in centers in major cities where a lot of refugees have been resettled. So certainly art therapy, comics making, theater productions, there's a whole kind of movement of artists and other kinds of cultural workers who are participating with nonprofits. And I will say there are also comics that have been kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum, which we don't look at in the book. We chose not to look at anti-refugee comics, but there have been a few examples, particularly of states or governments using comics as deterrents against people seeking asylum. One of the most notorious examples was reported by The Guardian, and it was from 2015. It was a comic called No Way that was posted online on the website of the Australian Department of Immigration and Border Protection. And it's about 18 pages, I think, and it's silent. So there's no words. So anyone in any language can understand it. And it shows men who look sort of Middle Eastern having very bad experiences, not only on the journey over as they're trying to get on, these leaky boats to get to Australia, but once they're settled, they're miserable. And this was used, although they refused to comment, but it seemed that when people would go to their website to find out how to seek asylum, this comic was being used to communicate a message that they were not welcome.
Mm.
So not all comics depicting refugees are positive.
Okay. Anything you want to add, Dom?
Yeah, I mean, Candida's pointed to a couple of or a few really great examples of the kind of infrastructure for the production of refugee comics, and that is part of a really thick publishing ecology, basically, or activist ecology, as Candida mentioned. So a really great example, a kind of really in the UK, especially a kind of pioneer of telling refugee stories in comics is the organisation Positive Negatives, who are a kind of not-for-profit based at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, with kind of a sort of rotating cachet of artists that they employ, and with kind of people, researchers with ethnographic expertise who go out and interview refugees and then take those stories, work with artists to translate them into sort of comics or to drafts of comics, and then take those drafts of comics back to the refugees to say, does this accurately represent your story? And I think that kind of feeds, and then Positive Negatives tend to publish on their website, but there's also been that kind of really interesting social media has liberated comics artists in some sense, in the sense that they now have their own publishing platforms on Instagram and other social media. And that has also created not a pipeline, but again, it's another key part of this ecology. So I'm thinking of someone like Kate Evans, who published a kind of a blog about her experience working as a volunteer in the Calais refugee camp in North France in sort of 2015, 2016. And then that was picked up by the left-wing publisher Verso, who turned it into this really beautiful book, which is a great example of what we would think of as refugee comics. And again, something like Layla Abdul Razak, her comic biography of her father, her Palestinian father, it's called Badawi, about his time growing up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. It's published by Ad Astra Comics. And Ad Astra Comics, they're an independent indie publisher whose tagline is "The panel is political." So there's a kind of whole really robust infrastructure for this kind of narrative artwork.
Yeah, and it's sounding like really these comics can take almost any kind of format, or be published across any medium, and often start in one medium, end up in another. As you mentioned, Don, they can start as a blog and end up as a book. Yeah, so there's really not any one kind of way these things are produced. Yeah, Candida, you mentioned Vin Win in the introduction. I wanted to highlight another comment that stuck out for us, which is the visualization of refugees is also essentially about seeing us, citizens, non-refugees, those currently with rights and safety. So I was wondering how that reflects who the readership of refugee comics is, and how is the reader a key part of the comic's creation, tone, and impact. Candida, I'll direct that to you.
Sure. I mean, that has been a huge question for us too. And about halfway through writing the book, Dom and I paused and we said, we need to deal with this question because we're talking about these as, literary scholars or communication scholars. We're looking at how these texts represent refugees, but we really need to think about the kind of audience they are directed at. And there's no one answer. So in terms of the kind of organizations and platforms, some of these comics are directed at refugees, as I mentioned. And there are also comics that are being made for people in refugee camps. There's a comic, one of our comic studies colleagues in the US is also a comics maker, A. David Lewis. And he set up an organization to make comics for Syrian children, to tell short comics of Syrian folklore stories, to help them feel proud of their culture and to have a sense of their own history. And those were distributed in camps. So there are projects creating comics directly for people who are refugees. But I would say most of the comics we're looking at, most of the comics being sold in bookstores or comic shops or online are really targeted at non-refugee readers. Some very directly for those activist causes, some to raise funds, some to raise awareness. But I think the implied reader of most of the comics we're looking at is someone who is not a refugee. So that then presented us with a problem because the kind of default language that we tend to use in work like this to separate the people who are refugees from non is the Western reader, right? Because so many refugees are from the global South and they're trying to get to what we might call the West. Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand.
Mhm.
But that doesn't work as a term, the Western reader. It's too broad, it's too oversimplifying. There are people who are refugees in the West who read comics themselves. Are they Western readers? And then, of course, there are people who are citizens in the West who may not enjoy all the rights of citizenship because of their race or ethnicity or social class or whatever. So we really kind of struggle to think about a term we could use for this implied reader rather than constantly calling them the non-refugee reader, which is also clunky and kind of too broad. So we came up with an imperfect and also a bit clunky term. But we in the book, we started using the term citizen reader and citizen viewer to make it very clear that the citizen is the ideal reader, someone who enjoys the benefits of citizenship. And also that these books are really asking we who are citizens to think about how we are part of the refugee situation. The very idea of a refugee can only exist if there's an idea of a citizen and vice versa. So we are also all implicated. And that's something we talk about a lot in the book, how comics can work to implicate us and to help us see how the systems and structures that create someone who is a refugee, who's living precariously, who's stateless, has no papers, that can exist because there are those of us in the opposite situation.
Mhm.
So that's a kind of complex answer to what we're talking about, but it really took us a lot of work thinking through who are these books for in a kind of deep way.
Mhm. Excellent.
Just building on what Candida was saying there, I just wanted to add that I think the notion of the citizen viewer, we wanted to avoid coming up with clunky academic terms where they're not absolutely necessary. But we really feel that this understanding the way in which refugee comics are addressing themselves to a citizen reader or a citizen viewer is really important because it reveals not just the kind of we're being invited to empathize with the refugee experience and they don't have citizenship, isn't that terrible, but actually opens up a much bigger historical and political relationship. I think we so often think of citizens or citizenry or citizenship as something that's fixed and always been there. But actually, a lot of the things that refugee comics do is they show us how that relationship between who is a citizen, who is a refugee, the rights that each have is constantly shifting and changing. It's actually also incredibly recent. And so a really great example of this, or the way that this allows us to read comics in a more expansive way, in a more historical way, would be, for example, when you start reading comics about sea crossings on the Mediterranean, you start to see how actually there's kind of a reference, all these references to the ocean and the perilous ocean and the danger of the crossing. There starts to be echoes in that passage over the Mediterranean Sea. There starts to be echoes of the Middle Passage, of the kidnapping and transportation of Africans to the Americas as enslaved peoples. And actually that suddenly, that was the epitome of the denial of citizenship, right? Or the denial of humanity. So we start to see the longer historical and political context behind these terms, citizen, refugee, and to understand how comics help us to come to terms with those.
You just heard from Candida Rifkind and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They're co-authors of the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we talk about how the book came together, learn more about the writers and artists who are profiled, and the ethical dynamics between artist and subject. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.